Datis Kharrazian, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Jason. Thanks for having me.
So, we were chatting a little bit offline, and you were blowing my mind with some of the things you shared. You're one of those guys that is always on the cutting edge of these things. That's why I love talking to you. You're always teaching me something new, and I'm really fascinated with the work that you've been doing around the SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus, COVID stuff, and the data that you and your team and your partners have really come to the forefront with, that I think is really, really unique. At least I've never seen anything out there in the discussions about these type of things. So that's really where I'd love to start. When we talk about this sort of coronavirus thing, I think a lot of people are familiar with the fact that it affects the lungs, but maybe you can go into some detail about what the science is showing about how it affects the lungs, and then some of the things that you guys have been looking at with regard to antibodies and the research that you guys do.
Sure. So I can only talk to you about my level of research and specialty. I can't. I'm not an expert in There's so many different specialties in any
Yes.
kind of viral infection. So the work I do is mostly with cross-reactivity, molecular mimicry, and its role in autoimmunity. So my mentor and myself, Risto Vijdani, we did a paper recently, did a study recently, and we published the early findings in the Journal of Clinical Immunology. And what we found and what we're looking for is for cross-reactivity. So cross-reactivity can occur with any infection, but viruses are the most common type. And what happens in cross-reactivity is antibodies made against the virus can potentially bind to other tissue proteins in the human body, and that's called molecular mimicry as well. So the concerns for cross-reactivity are two. One is if there's cross-reactivity with a viral infection, when they make vaccines, it gives you potential target sites where a vaccine may cause some issues, because the antibodies formed from the vaccine, if they're cross-reactive to certain tissue proteins, it can be a problem. Like with the recent viral infection in China, what they found was that some of the vaccines that they developed for the bird flu were causing antibodies against a specific target protein, causing narcolepsy due to molecular mimicry. And molecular mimicry has been found to happen with infections or vaccines. So we wanted to look at a research study where we go, is there any cross-reactivity with the current COVID-19 virus? And when you look at the virus, there's two proteins. There is a spike protein, and then there's a nuclear protein. So we measured cross-reactivity against multiple tissue human proteins to see if there's any molecular mimicry. And we found that there was. So as soon as we found this out, we submitted a letter to the editor, Journal of Clinical Immunology, and we found that for some, and again, just because it's cross-reactive doesn't mean a person can get it, but there's potential for cross-reactivity with SARS-CoV-2, both nuclear protein and the spike proteins, to cause neurological autoimmune reactions, and to also break down barriers, and also to impact joints. So several autoimmune target proteins are found, and we're still finishing up more work on this, but we have some other studies in the submission as we speak right now.
Well, beautiful. And that's maybe a very high level recap. And so it occurred to me, we might want to back up, or I might want to back this up a little bit for some people who aren't familiar with your work as I am. We just dive into the deep stuff right away. So when somebody encounters some sort of infection, let's just start with it. Yep. Let's just keep it on an infection level. We talk about antibodies. I think some people are familiar with the term antibodies. You might have some sort of definition of what an antibody is and what it does, but maybe you can start there. And
Sure.
In a normal reaction, forgetting the cross-reactive aspects, what does our body do when it produces antibodies, and what are the antibodies for?
Sure. So if you get, for example, a virus or a bacteria or some kind of pathogen comes into your body, you have an initial immune response, which is called cell-mediated immune response. And you have these different immune cells called macrophages, and they just start engulfing and attacking whatever's foreign. The problem is they're not that strong and they're not that aggressive. When it comes to viruses, they don't do a very good job. In order for a body to deal with a virus, we really need precision to find the viral pathogen, and we need really strong, powerful immune cells called natural killer cells and T cells to come in and destroy it. And the way that the immune system helps these strong immune cells find these viral pathogens is by producing what are called antibodies. And there's cells in the immune system called B cells. And what B cells do is when a virus comes in, they figure out the protein structure of it, and they create something called an antibody, which is nothing more than a protein that attaches to the virus. But as soon as that protein is attached to that virus, or that antibody is attached to the virus, the immune system knows exactly where it is, and it goes into aggressive destruction against it. So in order for us to really fight off viral infections, we have to have this antibody production. So when you get someone who gets sick and they get that common cold or flu and they're getting a viral infection, the reason it can take 7 to 10 days to really get over it is because it takes that long to make antibodies. So even though you have an immediate immune response against the pathogen, if it takes hold of you, the only chance you really have to get rid of it is to make these antibodies. So antibodies are great for us, and they help fight these pathogens. Now, antibodies that are formed against like an infection have the potential to cause some adverse problems too. And that's what cross-reactivity is, a term that is used when antibodies formed against a pathogen can also bind to not just the pathogen, but to self-tissue proteins.
And so why would that happen? What, like, that seems like almost like a mistake or something, but I know the body doesn't really make mistakes. It's pretty darn wise. So what is that's happening right there?
Sure. So when antibodies formed, it's formed against a specific amino acid sequence. So antibodies are formed against proteins, and pathogens come in and they have their own proteins. And there's a sequence of amino acids, which are building blocks of protein, that are there like a message. And an antibody is formed against that sequence. But that sequence of proteins is shared by sometimes our own body. And if there's proteins in our body that have the same amino acid sequence, then antibodies made against the pathogen can also bind to our own human tissue proteins, and that's called cross-reactivity.
Okay, so these antibodies are kind of reading a sequence of amino acids, and if it sees that sequence in something else in the body, could be another virus, could be even a bacteria. I'm just hypothesizing theoretically here. It could be anything with protein, essentially, right? That has DNA or RNA or any protein structure. Could be food, right? There's all these things that are in our body somewhere that have these sequences of amino acids, and if it finds that, it's essentially going to put a flag in it and go, "Hey, here's that thing that we've been looking for." Is that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. And it also can be protective. So there's many coronaviruses. So there's other strains of coronaviruses that have similar amino acid sequences to the current COVID-19 strain. So some people have immunity because the antibodies they've already developed are so similar to the new strain that they're already immune to it. And then there's other infections that researchers are publishing that may have some cross-reactivity to be protective. So some early studies show that whooping cough, pertussis, antibodies may be very similar to coronavirus, and if people have had whooping cough infection, that they may actually have immunity because the antibody is so similar in structure. So cross-reactivity could be good or bad. Cross-reactivity is why other infections have protected us from new ones, because the antibodies made to the similar sequence protein. And if they are similar enough, they attach to it and the immune system can do its job. The bad part is when these amino acid similarities are to our own tissues. And that can then trigger what's called an autoimmune response, where the immune system attacks yourself, self-immune reactions.
And so if we develop antibodies to something, does that mean that there's an automatic destructive response by the body? Is there an automatic, like, hey, we got to kill this thing? Or is there situations where we develop antibodies, it kind of gets tagged, and there's no destructive aspect?
Sure. There is the whole field of research in this called protective antibodies and regulatory B cells. But not to get too technical, here's the basic concept. For listeners that aren't like really familiar with immunology, when an infection comes in, you will make antibodies against that pathogen, and that's very protective for us. It helps your immune system fight it off. Okay. Now, if there's cross-reactivity, meaning that virus has similar proteins to our own tissue, like for example with SARS-CoV-2 can cross-react with the thyroid or myelin, that only happens when there's a second criteria that takes place in humans, which is what's called loss of immune tolerance.
Okay. And by the way, this is what your research has shown, that it actually can cross-react to those tissues that you just mentioned. Yeah.
So our research has found like the SARS-CoV-2 strain can cross-react with human tissue proteins, but that doesn't necessarily mean if you get coronavirus infection that you're going to have that happen. So but that will potentially happen with people that already have lost what's called immune tolerance. And immune tolerance means you have a set of immune mechanisms in place in your body where your body distinguishes yourself from a pathogen. And if your body has lost that ability to distinguish yourself from a pathogen, then cross-reactivity to a virus can really have a negative effect on you.
So it's almost like we it might get tagged as cross-reactive, or it's, hey, here's that amino acid sequence. But then if we have good immune tolerance, good self-tolerance, then there's a sort of another, let's say, level of intelligence in the body that says, oh wait, this is good. This is thyroid. We don't want to attack this. Am I sort of laymanly speaking this correctly? Okay.
So if your tolerance is there, if you have antibodies, even if there's amino acid similar sequences with a pathogen in your own tissue, those antibodies don't destroy it. The antibody binding doesn't destroy the tissue. So it's not just the antibodies itself that are a problem. It's the antibodies plus losing tolerance.
Right.
And this could explain why there's some people that are having significant reactions to infection and some people are not.
Well, and just this initial piece that you're breaking down for me right now is helping to, I wouldn't say answer things, but it actually helps explain why there's so much confusion around this whole topic, right? Because I've seen reports, and it's hard to distinguish honestly what's true and what's not true, because you see everything, right? So I don't want to put any statements out there, but I do see reports that say that there's people that they're testing that have antibodies that never experience any symptoms. Now, there's a lot of reasons that could be explained, right? I mean, the testing isn't 100% accurate. We know that. There's a lot of things, right? But what you're sharing is interesting, because to me, what it suggests is that if I maintain good immune tolerance and I've been interacting with the natural world for a while, meaning I've gotten sick a bunch in my life, my immune system's actually built up some intelligence, some sort of muscle memory, so to speak. Like it's actually been in the gym working out and keeping me safe. And so I can actually develop a little bit of immune resistance, so to speak, to some of these things that appear, quote unquote, novel, but my body's already developed some kind of intelligence to them. Am I making too big of a leap here for this type of thing?
No, I mean, everything you said is accurate. There's just exceptions to everything, and there's
right.
and that's the problem with the immune system. There's always an exception for every rule, and that's why it's so complicated. But the key thing though is that with cross-reactivity though, you could get the infection and you could get symptoms, but whether you get the infection and get symptoms and develop autoimmunity is a separate issue. And that's what we studied.
Right.
So there's going to be some people that get the infection, some will have symptoms, some people won't. That doesn't really matter. Having tolerance doesn't mean you'll have symptoms or not have symptoms. Having tolerance means that the antibody production against the virus turn into attack against your own tissue.
Right.
So for some people, they'll get coronavirus and be asymptomatic, but they've already lost tolerance, and now they have an autoimmune disease that can turn on from that. And there could be other people that have all the symptoms of recovery and have to go through the whole coronavirus infection, and then they recover from it, but they may never really be the same because it turned on an autoimmune response. So being asymptomatic or doesn't really matter for cross-reactivity.
Right. No, absolutely. And this is what's so fascinating with kind of this work that you're doing, because some of it has to do with understanding how people may or may not be affected in this sort of initial infection, let's say. But to me, I wasn't aware that there's this secondary nature to this whole thing, which is that, okay, after you get through this phase, whether it's asymptomatic, whether it's mild, or whether it's severe, there's sort of this next level thing that I wouldn't say we have to worry about, but that's a reality that we probably should be aware of, which is that we could have long lasting effects that can stem from this. And what it suggests to me, and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth or leap too far here scientifically, but if SARS-CoV-2 can do this, then pretty much any, at least viral infection or any infection, could probably potentiate something like this. Is that fair to assume?
Yeah, there's hundreds of papers in the field of immunology of viral cross-reactivity.
Okay, good. So I'm not assuming it's already there. That's good. But it kind of makes sense. I mean, if it applies here, it's going to apply many places. So just clarify what you're saying here, just so people can wrap their head around it, because I think it's another level here. So if somebody is infected, whether they know it or not, what's next after they feel like they've moved through that? What's the potential for downstream issues if we don't make changes and make positive improvements to our lives.
So let's say you have one group, one population that has immune tolerance, which means their immune system is fit. They know how to distinguish pathogen from self. And then one group of patients that do not have tolerance. And people that don't have tolerance typically are those that have an autoimmune disease. They may already have rheumatoid arthritis, they may already have a thyroid disorder or some kind of
Hashimoto's or right.
And then someone, or they have multiple food intolerances, multiple reactions to chemicals. Those are all signs of loss of tolerance. So this group and this group, let's say they both get infected, there's a completely different outcome in these two groups because of cross-reactivity.
Right.
So since this group has tolerance, whether they have asymptomatic symptoms or no symptoms of the infection, there's no concern for this cross-reactivity to cause any problems because they have this fitness of their tolerance of their immune system. So it can distinguish self from non-self. But with this group that has lost tolerance, when they get the infection, again, whether they're symptomatic or asymptomatic, as long as the infection comes in, they raise their antibodies. Those antibodies can cross and bind to tissue proteins that are very similar to the amino acid sequence of coronavirus. And they can, SARS-CoV-2 is what we study specifically of the coronavirus strains. And those people can then afterwards, all of a sudden have some target proteins we found. Like one of them was TPO, was Hashimoto's. One of them was myelin basic protein, which could be demyelination. So those are all.
That would be like what potential, like MS that is down the line.
Yep.
Okay.
So that could be the trigger that then, with a combination of the loss of tolerance and gene susceptibility, that then turns them over to the other side. So that's the principle of not just our research, but the entire field of viral cross-reactivity itself. So all we did in our study is we didn't discover viral cross-reactivity. All we did in our study is find out which proteins have amino acid sequences with SARS-CoV-2 proteins.
Yeah. It's funny. Every time I talk to you about the work that you do, I feel like one day you just accidentally stumbled into cross-reactivity and you opened up Pandora's box and like you can't get out now because this stuff's everywhere. I say that sort of lovingly in sort of with admiration because what you're highlighting starts to put a lot of pieces together and opens up this box of how important it is to maintain self-tolerance and immune tolerance.
Right. Well, I mean, for me, it's not that I came up with it. I had a mentor, Dr. Rishabajani, who was a leading expert in the field, and I did my PhD work under his mentorship. So that's how I learned about it.
I love Aristo. He's fantastic. His work really is pioneering in so many ways, and it's just impressive to see how far it's continued to go and how relevant it is. I think that's what's interesting because a lot of research kind of maintains it just ends up in these academic circles. This one's so relevant to our time because I mean, so many people are sensitive to foods. They've lost immune tolerance to foods. And then of course to self, right? And autoimmune disease is continuing to progress and we see multiple autoimmune conditions showing up in the same person and chemical sensitivities. And it's becoming more of an issue in the last decade or more, right?
Yep, and that's very clear in epidemiological research and population-based studies. It's happening more frequently and it's happening at younger ages. So and things like this. There's going to be a timeline of different populations from this pandemic. We're going to see a huge spike in autoimmune diseases, and we're probably going to see a spike specific to which areas we found cross-reactivity within our study.
So the next place I want to take the conversation is, I think, applicable to not only anybody who's perhaps or knowingly dealt with SARS-CoV-2, but also for anybody who has autoimmune disease, food sensitivities, chemical sensitivities, and is sort of in this camp of loss of tolerance. So if I know that I'm in that situation or I suspect that I am, how do I sort of start to think about that in terms of what do I need to do? How do I get tested? Like where do I start when I sort of open myself up to that?
Right. So this is, so for me, I have kind of two separate careers, but then work together. I have my career as a researcher and I just do research, but then I have a practice as a functional medicine practitioner where we do diet, lifestyle, personalized medicine approaches. So, when you have this issue of tolerance, like what can you do? So for me, the protocol that I put together for myself and have taught to other people is what I call the 3D program. And the 3D program stands for diversify, uh, distinguish, and downregulate. And those are specific immune mechanisms that are involved. So we can do those things with diet, nutrition, and lifestyle medicine to improve our immune tolerance. The key thing is you have to have your immune tolerance as fit as possible, before the infection. If you get the infection, get cross-reactivity, improving immune tolerance can calm it down, but it's a kind of, it's a little too late. But the point is, this isn't going to be the only viral infection. This is not going to be the only trigger, because other infections will come in, whether it's a pandemic or not. But if you have lost your tolerance, you're at major risk for chronic inflammation, chronic autoimmunity, and so forth. So there's something to address. And there's no
Yeah.
medications for improving tolerance. Improving
I,
tolerance is diet, nutrition, and lifestyle, and trying to improve your overall immune health. So I can share with you some of the things the research has shown to improve tolerance if you want to.
yeah. No, I was just going to sort of allude to that once we get into this sort of part of health, the medical world as it is now doesn't really have any solutions from a drug or even a mechanistic explanation. I mean, if you talk to most doctors about this, they're not going to understand unless they're taking your courses or in sort of this integrative functional medicine camp, and have maybe potentially read some of these studies, but again, that's not most. So it's become very tricky for, I think, many people, once they sort of feel like, and I think, look, most people know without even testing, they kind of have a sense of sensitivities. And while that may not be 100% accurate, like I think most people just get a sense for these things as they live in their life. So yeah, what can the average person do to start down that path of improving their tolerance?
Right. And just one key thing also is, people use the word immunity all the time, and immunity means your immune system is strong, and they usually refer that to just being able to fight off infections, right?
Right.
But there's another part of immunity which is a little more detailed, which is immune tolerance, which means you don't attack your own tissue. It's not just about fighting off infection. So specific to the immune tolerance part of it, one of the most important issues is one of the D's, which is called diversify. And diversity and diversification really refers to your diet and your microbiome because they're related to each other. Now, one of the things that's happening right now is we're for sure populations are going to losing their diversity because there's no more human contact with each other. So we carry bacteria in our hands and microbes, and we touch doors and we touch things, and we don't sanitize all the time. And and that's through bacteria, which is really great for us because it helps diversify our gut. But for a pandemic, it's appropriate because we're trying to decrease the viral spread as a public health concern, and everyone's sanitizing, which is great. But it's going to mean that our gut diversity could be impacted, or not just our gut diversity, but our lung diversity, or anywhere we have a microbiome, or nasal epithelium, or throat, or lung,
Eyes. Yeah.
everywhere. Yeah. So we do need to get constant exposure to different bacteria strains to support us. So I think the sterilization, which is appropriate for public health or viral issues, is going to, first of all, decrease our diversity. But from a dietary perspective and from a lifestyle perspective, eating a very diverse diet is one of the most important things to have microbiome diversity. And the more diverse the microbiome is, the healthier you are. So if a person's eating the same food every day, the same salad, and they're, in a sense, only eating foods they really like over and over and over again, and never just diversifying their diet to eat multiple different fibers, then there's a problem. So, when I work with patients that have autoimmune disease or have chronic food sensitivities or chronic tolerance issues, what we do is we try to have them immediately increase the diversity of their vegetables, and we have them do something that we call a microbiome mashup, where they take like 30 different vegetables and they take them to the food processor, grind them all up, and then they make these jars and they have a couple tablespoons of those every day, better than any supplement. The goal of that is to start diversifying their gut bacteria and the microbiome. So that's one very powerful way to improve not just your immunity, but your immune tolerance.
And you're highlighting diversity here. So it's not like you have to eat, you have to mash up all these things and eat a bowl of it, right? Like you're actually just small amounts.
Yeah, a couple tablespoons of water,
right.
Drink it. That's it.
Yeah.
So the more fiber you have, then that serves as a bulking agent and has different health benefits. But for diversity of the gut, it's not about the bulk. It's about how diverse each fiber is. And it's specific to plant fibers. So eating different types of animal meats is not going to change your microbiome diversity. It's really plant fibers that really have the big impact on changing that diversity.
Right. And we
So,
only have the colors in there too, right? The polyphenols. And I mean, I know one of our mutual friends, Deanna Minnick, is sort
oh
of
yeah,
all about that, right? And it's
yeah,
a huge part of
rainbow
it.
dye. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. She does a great job doing talk about polyphenols and rainbow dye. Yeah, and from a polyphenol perspective, yeah, things with color have its own additive benefits and antioxidants. But simply from a microbiome diversity, you just want different types of plant fibers. And I think most people, even people that eat really healthy, they kind of just go, "Well, that's my salad. It's the same vegetables I use all the time," and then they don't make that
It's
effort.
honestly, it is an effort, right? I mean, if you think about hunter gatherers or even more, let's say people that live in a more natural way, they would
Yeah,
naturally have diversity through um, both the seasonal aspect of things, like certain vegetables can grow in certain conditions. And so they're always planting new things. They're going with the seasons. And so there's a natural diversity based on their environment and based on the seasons where it's just not our world anymore. So we have to actually make an effort, right? I mean, even for somebody like you and I've talked to you
yeah,
about this stuff enough that like I fall into these habits. And so I have to consciously like, okay, I need to get this thing. I don't rarely get this anymore. So let me grab this. I haven't eaten that in a while, right? So it's kind of a constant thing that you have to really
yeah,
put effort into. Yeah.
absolutely. It's definitely something to
Okay.
like.
So diversity,
Yeah, diversity is one of the key ones.
and
Okay.
what's the next one?
So you can get into we can get into the, let's say, distinguish. Distinguish is a there's many patterns of distinguish. One of the easiest ones and the most common ones to implement is just uh, you're improving your function of regulatory T cells, because regulatory T cells are distinguish pathogen from non-pathogen. And the most common lifestyle things that change regulatory T cell functions are physical exercise, physical movement. So when you exercise and move, opioids turn on Treg cells. Uh, Vitamin D, sunlight turns on Treg cells. So just being outside and not being sedentary, and then even if you're outside and walking around natural environment, touching things and being exposed to things, which ancestrally have always done,
Right.
those are the key things that improve our immune tolerance. So one of the things I think that's causing this explosion of loss of tolerance is just people don't have diversity in their diets. They're sedentary, not getting sunlight, they're not getting out there anymore. And all those things are just shifting the immune system because it needs those things to function properly. So the key things is just when you get an exercise high, an opioid response, you're turning on Treg cells. That's helping you distinguish your pathogens and non-pathogens, your own tissues from cell tissues and food proteins that you react to or shouldn't react to. So
And
that
does it matter what type of exercise, or is this any
uh,
type of exercise?
so it's basically opioid release. So as long as if you don't get an exercise high from it, you're gonna have very little effect on Treg cells.
So it's
If you
going to
just
have
go
to be
for
a
a walk,
little bit
yeah,
like intense to some degree. And
right,
intense can be different for everybody, right? It could be walking up a steep hill for somebody, or it could be doing massive wind sprints for somebody else, right?
yeah. So it's not necessarily based on duration. So
Right.
if you did a 3 hour walk, but your heart rate you don't get this exercise high after, it's not the same thing. But it has its own benefits for many other things. But as far as specific to Treg cells, you need to get that boost up. So what they found is higher intensity workouts do have that boost. It doesn't have to be for a long period of time.
Got it.
Like popular right now are like 7 minute workouts where people, or 3 minute workouts. They just do jumping jacks for 3 minutes and squats for 3 minutes, and or 30-second burst or whatever. And they go through that series of just a few minutes of getting their heart rate up at a high intensity, and that will have phenomenal impacts on opioids, right? But if you really wanted to burn lots of calories, that's not going to have the same effect. You need to really do it for a longer duration of some kind of exercise. But for the immune effect, it's that quick burst. So if you are going for a casual walk, just get your heart rate up, for 30 seconds in between it, or get some really high intense activity, even if it's a short period of time that doesn't totally wipe you out, just to get your opioid response. Right?
Right. And not to sort of uh, undervalue or try to minimize the effect of exercise, because there's a million benefits. But one of the other things I find as it relates to this particular topic is that I always find personally, and I know it to be true in the literature, that exercise, good intense exercise, even if it's not for a long duration, improves sleep. Right. I always sleep better when I exercise in at least a somewhat intense way.
Yeah,
And of course, sleep has a further impact on
yeah,
this T-reg aspect of things as well, right?
yeah, absolutely. So the easiest ones are just exercise and lifestyle. And then that's for the second D, which we talked about, which is kind of to distinguish, and then to downregulate. And then downregulate means the exposures you get, the pathogens you get, the food proteins you get, the environmental pollutants you get don't really totally aggravate you. And there's many mechanisms involved here, but one of the easiest mechanisms to understand is your production of what are called SIGA cells. And SIGA cells are what we call secretory IgA cells. And when pollutants or pathogens come in, they surround them and wrap around them so they don't overburden your immune system and cause what are called other cells, dendritic cells, to overreact. And those SIGA cells are profoundly impacted from a psychoneuroimmune response, where they can take subjects into a room and show them acts of violence for an hour, and then they can see their SIGA levels drop right after that. And then they can, with someone in a group of subjects in the room, and see acts of kindness and love and see their SIGA levels go up, you know? So so that's one of the key things associated with downregulate, getting SIGA cells up. So pathogens and pollutants that come in don't just totally overreact, cause your system to overreact. So, you take a person who only watches all the terrible stuff happening on the news. It's all negative. They have a very limited diet. They don't get much movement. And now you've got a person that, especially over a period of time, that starts to lose their tolerance. They're not going to react to an infection like somebody else, right?
Right.
So that's the key thing. And as they continue to do this, as they start to lose their tolerance, there'll be more and more food reactions, then chemical reactions, and then autoimmune disease. And then when pathogens come in, like a virus, which everyone's focused in right now with this pandemic, but other viruses will always be there, that can then trigger this cross-reactivity, which then can really cause a whole series of negative effects in autoimmune disease development.
So, I love that you generally, as far as I know, I've always talked to you, you have a great balance of perspectives on things. And, in a very polarized world, we see people kind of going into this camp or that camp. And that's just kind of the way it is, unfortunately. You really stick to the science and try to make decisions based on the science. And I sort of lead into it with that, because what I'm hearing from you is some of the things that you're describing to improve your immune tolerance are difficult given this sort of quarantine, stay at home, social distance type of lifestyle that is being thrust upon a lot of people, right? And what I mean by that is that when we're giving these instructions, I think there's some validity to them, right? As you mentioned, you want to slow down sort of the velocity of the transmission of this infection. And yet there's a tendency for many people, including myself, that, when I'm sort of told to stay at home and I can't go to the gym like I normally do, I can still work out, but I love going to the gym and sitting in the sauna and like pushing heavy weights around. And that's more difficult for me now. I can do other things, sure. But there's also this tendency, well, there's not a lot to do. We can't go hang out we can't go have a barbecue at my friend's house because that's, and so I'm watching more Netflix and might be some show that involves a lot of killing. And so, there's these like push and pull types of things. So I say all that to sort of ask you the question, given what you know about immune tolerance and also respecting some of the potential positives of the policy, how can I best navigate, this idea of sort of maintaining some safety with regard to other people, but also get outside and get some sun and sort of play this middle ground. You get my point? It's kind of tricky for a lot of us.
I agree. And I think for most of us, that when this dramatic change happened, we got depression, and we had our own issues to deal with, and our life changed. And I know my wife
and we overeat
we became wife connoisseurs all of a sudden.
Exactly.
More often. And those things are okay too, because you have to have joy, and joy raises opioids and things like that, right? But also, I had a good friend of mine I was talking to, he goes, this is actually the time for people to really focus on making themselves better. Because they're at home, they can really focus on things, they have their thoughts, so you can really just focus on improving your immune tolerance if you really wanted to, right? You could put an extra effort into diversifying your vegetable intake, right? You could do, at the very least, a 7-minute workout to get an opioid response, or maybe this is your time to really focus on getting in shape, or to whatever that brings you joy and happiness and so forth, and not playing victim and having all these negative things take you down. Because for some people, I think this pandemic is going to cause them to really optimize where they're at in life, whether it's their health or their academics or whatever is important to them, their family relationships. For other people, it's going to just destroy them, and they're going to like be victim of it. So that's a personal choice, you know. I think there's just so many variables and factors for each person. Everyone has their own demons and their own stuff, whether they're motivated or not to do it. So,
yeah,
you know, at least I'm really grateful that you're sharing a lot of this information for people, because obviously people that are listening to this summit and this program you developed are ones that want to figure out what to do, right? So that's good.
yeah. And to your point, you know, I think there's perhaps even a little bit of this in all of us, right? Times where we kind of go down in the dumps and we get derailed, and then we snap back out of it and we pull ourselves out and like, you know what, that's not what I want to do. I want to make this change. And I've gone through that myself with not only during this period, but in my life, right? So this is a constant sort of readjustment, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah, it's really important to remember that. And when I work with my patients, which are mostly chronic disease, autoimmune patients, I tell them to go, hey, here's what's going to happen. You're going to follow guidelines. You're going to feel great. You're going to be human. Things are going to happen. Slowly forget. You're going to crash and burn. We're going to have to remind you to get focused in again. And that's going to be an ongoing thing. And that's how it is with everyone that is a human and dealing with life. So it's okay. You know,
yeah.
Like the point is that when you're ready to focus, what can you do? So if you're ready to focus, you can do all these strategies to improve immune tolerance or whatever else is useful for you, for whatever your needs are, right?
Right. Absolutely. And, you know, not to get too pluggy here, but it actually does make a lot of sense for your 3D immune tolerance program, because it is online, right? So if I wanted to do this, I can follow this program online.
Yeah, if you're interested in learning more about the immune tolerance program, I have written articles that are on my website. It's called Dr. K News, drknws.com, drnews.com. And then I did create an online program where we teach people each of the steps and like show them how to do a veggie mashup if they need help, and give them recipes, and then teach principles of diet and different nutraceuticals they can take if they wanted to go down that route, and lifestyle factors. And that was important for me because I think everyone was just so focused on immunity is all about just taking probiotics, and immunity is just about taking herbs to kill something. And it's really not just about those things.
I couldn't agree more. And it's kind of why we wanted to call this the immune resiliency, because there's something to this idea of getting knocked down in a sense, and also coming back stronger. Right. And I think that is the story of not only the immune system as a whole, or the body as a whole, but it's the story of sort of life itself, right? It's sort of this thing that we kind of just get knocked over. And so I you know, the immune system is not just this thing that we build up and it becomes this massive army that we protect ourselves, right? It's so much more nuanced and complex and intricate and interesting, and still unknown in a large
dynamic
reason.
Changing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So anyway, that's just my personal plug, honestly, for your program, because I didn't realize how valuable it was right now, given the SARS-CoV-2 thing. I mean, it's valuable in general because there's so many people that are struggling with this type of thing, but seems like it's even more valuable given what you're understanding about the current situation, and also really what this whole summit is about is protecting ourselves in the future, so that no matter what comes at us, we can deal with it with as much grace and ease as possible.
Right. Absolutely. And, you know, I think fundamentally everything comes back to the same things: get proper sleep, have a good relationship, eat well, you know, and it's just the fundamental truths of what human beings need to function at their peak, right?
It's definitely true. And there's more to that, which is that, and this is what you do with all the things that you teach, and you know, the clients and patients that you have. There's just individual natures to some of these things, right? Each of us have certain things that we probably need to focus on more than others. There's certain nutraceuticals, you know, I know you that's something that you help formulate. So you're deep in that world and that research. So you have a lot of good suggestions in that regard as well. So there's nuance to the individual, and there's also this broader thing that we all got to do the same things. It's just the human condition, right? So
we're all working on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. K, this has been fantastic. I love the work that you're doing. It's so enlightening in so many ways. And ironically, as you just mentioned, it kind of brings us back to the same things over and over again. But nevertheless, it's very profound regarding a lot of the things that we're currently dealing with in terms of immune tolerance and autoimmune disease, and helping us understand what I think was previously so very foreign and unknown.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. K. Good to see you, and I'm sure we'll see you again very soon.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.